Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to our second Company of Scholars lecture this year. This is our chance to hear from our colleagues all the interesting work that's going on campus. Today we have Emily Greenwood to speak with us. She's a professor of classics and currently also the director of undergraduate studies in the department. Emily trained at Cambridge University, receiving her BA, MPhil, and PhD degrees from Cambridge, after which she was a lecturer in Greek for several years at St. Andrews University, before joining the Yale faculty in 2009. Her research interests are rooted in ancient Greek historiography and Greek prose literature of the 5th and 6th centuries BCE, but she has very interesting, wide-ranging interests that carry her from ancient times into 20th century modern times and the influence of Greek literature on current events, or much more current to us anyway. She's the author of 2 books, Thucydides and The Shaping of History, published in 2006, and Afro-Greeks, Dialogues Between Anglophone Caribbean Literature and Classics in the 20th Century, which was published in 2010, and for which she was awarded the Runciman Prize, one of several prizes she's won. And she's currently working on a 3rd book called Classics, A Beginner's Guide, and is the author of many articles. Emily also taught in the first Mellon concentration course here at Yale that you may be familiar with, and the theme was Technologies of Knowledge, which she taught with Francesco Cassetti in the Film and Media Studies Department and with FAS Dean Tamar Gendler of the Philosophy Department. So today, Professor Greenwood will compare Thucydides' idea of the Great War, and that of course was the Peloponnesian War, with the figure of the Great War in British prose fiction and memoirs of the First World War in her talk, How to Write a War, Thucydides and British First World War Literature. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dean Cooley, and I'd like to thank you and Robin Ladouceur for organizing this series and for setting this particular lecture up. And above all, warm thanks to the audience here today. I can see many, many, many busy friends and colleagues in the audience. It's a great honor to give a Company of Scholars lecture. And in the spirit of the lecture series, I've chosen a topic that spans several different disciplines and which ideally should be tackled by a company rather than a lone individual scholar. So I'm particularly looking forward to the discussion after the talk. In the era of the digital humanities, I cherish the quite quaint-sounding idea of a company of scholars whose work is with our own bodies, digitally, corporally, mentally, and collectively, as a more knowing body, in order to conceive of and explore ever-expanding and ever-shifting fields of knowledge. Thinking about the individual scholar's role in all of this, I came across the term intermemory, used in computer science to describe, if I understand it correctly, and I quote, large-scale, highly survivable and available storage systems made up of widely distributed processes that are individually unreliable or trustworthy, with the overall system nevertheless secure. I don't want to characterize scholars in the humanities or scholars in any field as individually unreliable. That would be taking the strategy of rhetorical self-debasement too far. But what I cling to in that quotation is the interdependency of different disciplines. It's the bit about the overall system nevertheless secure that inspires me today. I guess you could also say that speaking in a Company of Scholars series, I have a slight performance anxiety, given that the last lecture in this series was literally given by a Company of Scholars, the great team of Valerie Hansen, Mary Miller, and Anders Windroth on the theme of circa 1000. So let me preface what I'm going to say by offering a bit of background as to why I've chosen this topic. At one level, it's part of a current project, which I'm calling Comparing Thucydides, where I'm staging a series of dialogues between Thucydides and different authors in antiquity and modernity. At another level, the material that I'm presenting today is part of a larger thinking through of the narrative structures and historical myths. And by myths, I don't mean fictions as such, I mean stories through which history is transmitted. So the narrative structures and historical myths that we live by in the 21st century. My own, and specifically, of course, in the case of this lecture, I'm going to be talking about narrative structures and historical myths of the First World War. My own first partial and subjective encounters with the collective memory and history making of the First World War derive from the 1980s and 90s, when I came across the subject of the First World War in the school curriculum in subtle, fragmented, but persistent ways. At the schools I attended in Britain, I saw memorials to the fallen about the school grounds, which inscribed roles of former pupils who had given their lives in the Great War. This was soon followed for me by the realization that the literature of the First World War was deadly serious within this curriculum, and in some sense hallowed. At the third school I attended, for example, pupils who misbehaved might be set as punishment. Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, the poem of 1854 relating to the Crimean War, and they'd have to memorize it as punishment or write it out 100 times. But the literature and the poems of the First World War would never be abused in this way. The fourth school that I attended had a very strong culture of voluntary service. An afternoon a week would be devoted to service, and one got to choose from a menu of different forms of service, one of which was an organization called the Combined Cadet Force, CCF. This was a program sponsored by the British Ministry of Defence. I ended up in the Royal Air Force division of this Combined Cadet Forces. Ostensibly, the rationale of this program was and is, because it still exists, is to instill discipline, leadership and strength of character in students through a soft introduction to military service. I didn't have any particular affinity for the armed forces at the time, but I think, and I'm fully aware of the fallibility of my own memory in thinking this, I think that I drifted into this combined cadet force because of the solemn impression of the lists of the fallen, not to mention monuments in village greens and town squares as I was growing up. But being taken to a shooting range and being made to shoot at a silhouette of a soldier immediately put me off, as did the fact that my afro wouldn't fit under the beret that was part of our regulation uniform. So I had to cut a slot in the back of my beret, and of course I promptly failed the first inspection on parade. I've begun with these vignettes not in any way to claim familiarity or affinity with the historical experience of the First World War, as it was experienced by combatants and civilians. I'm talking about Britain, which is just one of many, many theatres and countries horrifically experienced by this war. Nor have I told these vignettes to insert myself as an heir to the legacy of the British experience of the First World War, but rather as an act of disclosure, so as to why I might be susceptible to the complex politics and poetics of what our Yale colleague, Professor Jay Winter, has termed the crowded field of the historical remembrance of World War I. In the centennial of the First World War, I think that men and women around the world in all countries, in all of the countries that were involved in the war, and who are conscious of its vast losses, are wrestling with the burden and the aporia, the despondency and imponderability of memory, the aporia of trying to figure out an appropriate attitude of memory with regard to the global war and our relationship with a past for which we do not exist. And in using that phrase, a past for which we do not exist, I'm twisting a famous phrase of Joseph Brodsky, where he spoke about classical antiquity in the sense that while antiquity exists for us in modernity, we for antiquity do not. In the context of the centenary observation of the First World War, which has revived debates about the politics and protocols of memory in the different countries affected by the conflict, I've often asked myself what my discipline, classics, and specifically the sub-discipline of Greek historiography, knows that might usefully be part of a larger conversation about the commemoration of the First World War. Recent scholarship has furnished some excellent answers to this question. I've been particularly inspired, for instance, by Elizabeth Vandiver's work, Stand in the Trench, Achilles, Classical Receptions in British Poetry of the First World War. But Greek historiography hasn't been prominent in this discussion. Although in political thought and international relations, Thucydides' history is a familiar companion text for analysing wars of the 20th century. He's used, for example, as a dialogue piece for the First and Second World Wars, the Korean War, the Cold War more generally, and the First Gulf War. But when we turn to the literature of war in the 20th century, Thucydides hasn't been an obvious presence, whether in Britain or elsewhere. In this lecture, I'm not going to try to argue that Thucydides is an important presence in British First World War literature. Instead, I'm going to use a comparison between a select group of British First World War novels and memoirs to refocus the debate on the way in which this literature negotiates the discredited greatness of the First War, so-called Great War in Britain. I'll argue that Thucydides' account of a self-styled Great War, the war between the Athenians and the Peloponnesians in the 5th century BCE, reinvents the idea of the Great War in Western literature, reacting against the version of the Great War as epic, familiar from Homer's Iliad. And I'll also argue that a study of the narrative tropes and linguistic devices that Thucydides uses to construct his Great War help to tease out structures of narrative and meaning in British First World War literature that are characterised by disillusionment about the Great War. This dialogue with Thucydides adds a supplement to prevailing arguments that explain the ironic paradigm in terms of literary modernism and disillusionment with contemporary history. So I'm going to try and use the dialogue with Thucydides to disturb conventional periodizations and ways of explaining how a particular set of novels are characterized by disenchantment with the war. I should say as an aside that to focus a topic on the Great War and a dialogue about the Great War is, of course, parochial in many ways, insofar as the nomenclature of the Great War is used predominantly in Britain. La Grande Guerre is used far less in France, and De Grosses Krieg far less in Germany. So it's parochial in that sense, but I think that there's a more generalizable aspect here, in that the underlying question of the historiographical ethics of war writing is one that applies to the literature and commemoration of all wars in all places, and particularly how this war literature navigates the question of a heroic paradigm of greatness that shifts over the course of the unfolding of a war to a tragic paradigm of greatness. In scholarship on British literature of the First World War, the argument that this literature treats greatness as an ironic construct, and a construct that was ripe for satire, is associated above all with Paul Fussell's work, The Great War and Modern Memory, published in 1975. Since then, the cultural turn in literary studies has challenged Fussell's argument about the war as text and his corresponding attention to the self-conscious literariness of the war in works written overwhelmingly by men of the officer class. While this challenge and correction of Fussell is important, it hasn't undermined or reversed his insight that the works that constitute the canon, and I am aware that we're talking artificially here about a canon, the works that have come to constitute the canon of British First World War literature, subscribe to an ironic reading of the war, is still very much a current argument. I'm not going to tackle the important debate about the degree to which these ironic and disillusioned representations were more broadly representative of a prevailing tendency in the collective memory in Britain of the First World War. Instead, I want to examine the way in which the ironic mode links First World War literature in Britain to a larger meta-genre of critical war literature, and I'm going to pose affinities and similarities with a structural conundrum that Thucydides was faced with in writing up his war, namely how to reconcile an argument about the greatness of the war that he was writing in terms of its scale and importance, with the realization that its greatness was simultaneously a property of tragedy and was measured in loss. So I've suggested that in the Western historiographical tradition, Thucydides invents the figure of the Great War, a figure characterized by an emphasis on the unprecedented scale and significance of the war being narrated. At the level of narrative, this Thucydidean Great War is structured around a colossal reversal of expectations. It's underscored by the literary trope of irony, as I've said, and stylistically, this idea of the Great War in Thucydides is conveyed through rhetorical amplification, repeatedly through the use of superlative adjectives in the description of this war. In fact, it's in Thucydides that we get the idea of the Great War as an inherently comparative figure. In Thucydides' case, the principal comparison, as I've said, is with the Trojan War of Homeric epic, which he treats as a semi-fictional war. And then the other comparison, of course, is with Herodotus's narrative of the Persian Wars. In the preface to his histories, Herodotus had claimed that one of his aims, and I quote, is to preserve the fame of the important and remarkable achievements, the erga megala tekatomasta, produced by both Greeks and non-Greeks, i.e. Herodotus had claimed that his subject matter was great or important, but not that it was the greatest subject matter conceivable. Conversely, having introduced his subject matter as a great war, Thucydides quickly establishes it, or moves to establish it. We can obviously resist accepting his rhetoric, moves to establish it as a greater war than any other conflict ever written about. I quote, Thucydides of Athens wrote the war of the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, how they waged it against each other. He began writing at its very outset, in the expectation that this would be a great war, megante essestai, and more worthy of account than any previous ones. He based his judgment on the grounds that both sides came into the war at the height of their powers and in a full state of military readiness. And he also saw that the rest of the Greek world had either taken sides right at the start or was now planning to do so. This was certainly the greatest ever upheaval amongst the Greeks, and one which affected a good part of the barbarian world too, even, you could say, most of mankind, so a completely preemptive universal claim to the greatness of his subject. In respect, I continue, in respect of the preceding period and the still remoter past, the length of time that elapsed made it impossible to ascertain clearly from what happened, but from the evidence I find, I can trust in pushing my inquiries back as far as possible. I judge the early events were not on the same scale, either as regards their wars or in other respects. He reinforces it soon after by saying, or conceding, that although men always think that the war that they're at the moment engaged in is the greatest one, and when it's over they're even more impressed by earlier ones, nevertheless, for those who look at the actual facts, this war, the one he's narrating, the one I'm narrating in the voice of the Thucydidean narrator, will prove greater than earlier ones. This rhetoric of the singular greatness of the Atheno-Peloponnesian War is amplified in another famous passage, chapter 23 of Book 1 of Thucydides' history, where he stresses the unprecedented degree and scale of suffering characterized in the war. I find this particular passage particularly suggestive for the way in which it uses comparison to reiterate or underscore the idea of incomparability. This particular conflict was characterized by the fact that people suffered things unprecedented in any comparable period of time. Thucydides' calibration of the greatness of his war, and indeed his rhetorical construction of the greatness, then throws down the gauntlet for subsequent Greek historiography. All this is well known and much discussed in scholarship on Thucydides. The narrative techniques that characterize his narration, briefly outlined above, are omnipresent when we turn to the literature of the First World War in Britain. Although grammatically the positive degree of the adjective in the phrase the Great War has unmistakable, although when we use the phrase the Great War, the positive degree of the adjective great is unmarked, it has unmistakable connotations of superlativeness. The Great War is, in a sense, the greatest war. And it's because of the singularity implied by the pronoun, the Great War, as in the greatest war. And we only have to think about the way in which this nomenclature has stuck to concede the effectiveness of the device of rhetorical amplification in this phrase. Insofar as the Thucydidean conception of the Great War is inherently comparative, it necessarily undercuts itself. In Thucydides, this comes through clearly in Book 1, Chapter 10, in a famous hypothetical thought experiment where he asks his readers to consider what people of the future would conclude about Sparta's power in the second half of the 5th century BCE. What would they conclude about Sparta based on surveying its archaeological ruins? Just suppose, he asks his reader, the city of Sparta were wiped out and all that were left were its shrines and the foundations of its buildings. I think that years later, future generations would find it hard to believe that its power matched up to its reputation. In entering into comparison across historical time, Thucydides engages the impermanence of magnitude in the present. Although his war is allegedly the greatest war ever in terms of resources, deployment of forces, events, and consequent fallout, as the rhetoric of the passage that I've just read makes clear, this comparative historical perspective also implies the contingent nature of the greatness of the war. In other words, all this physical greatness, all the resources being poured into the war, which are spoken about at length in the first book of the history by the different states involved, all of this doesn't translate necessarily into ultimate success. In the war that Thucydides narrates, it's not the state Athens with the most resources, it's not the greatest state in physical terms that ultimately ends victorious. This observation ties into Thucydides' complex treatment of the instability of power, of dunamis, within the history. Lurking behind the statement at chapter 10 of Book 1 is a famous remark by Herodotus, Book 1, Chapter 5 of his Histories, where he says to his reader that he will cover minor and major settlements equally because those settlements that were important in the past have diminished in significance by now, and those which were great in my own time were small in times past. In Herodotus's histories, written roughly contemporaneously with Thucydides, Athens was a hegemonic power when Herodotus was writing, in the sense that it was encroaching all over the Greek world. But in Herodotus's histories, the version that he chooses to write, he goes back into the past, where Athens is a small state. It's small both from the perspective of the Persians who invade Greece, and it's small and fragile from the perspective of the other Greek states, who watch, many of whom sit on the sidelines to wait and see how its clash with Persia will play out. Herodotus's historical research, then, relies on criteria of magnitude that are inherently relative. The largest or greatest city or army is only so in comparison to other cities and armies, past and present. Following the scholar Marek Wachowski, I would argue that Herodotus's relativization of historical judgments about greatness is one of the generic traits that characterizes the emerging genre of history in the Greek world, and it's one that informs Thucydides' ironic and equivocal conception of greatness. Where in Thucydides the greatness of the war as event and subject doesn't reside in the fragile or contingent greatness of either of the states involved in the war. This trend in Greek historiography, I think, bequeaths an interesting legacy for a critical tradition of war writing. This legacy, in other words, is the insight that the greatness of the work will rely, in part, on the author's critical detachment and distance from prevailing conventions or scales of greatness. There's something decidedly anti-epic or anti-heroic about this strand of war writing, and this is long before we get to the anti-heroism of the disillusioned British First World War literature. I mentioned that Thucydides' ironization of the greatness of his great war, in which the greatness becomes increasingly tragic as the narrative proceeds, is suggestive for understanding the recurrence of irony as a governing trope in retrospective First World War literature written in the 1920s and 30s. The further argument that I want to make, and which I can only begin to sketch here, is that the works that have this ironic structure in British literature are often ones that are overtly preoccupied with what I'll call historiographical ethics, the how and why of the treatment of the historical past with respect to the truth or the reality of lived historical experience. Although avowedly and inescapably fictional by its very nature, All First World War literature is implicated in discourses of truth and history. As George Parfit noted in his book Fiction of the First World War, men and women who write about the Great War are seeking, for whatever reasons, to present some kind of truth about a conflict which was fought in several theatres, across thousands of miles, over several years, with vast armies. Parfit goes on to observe that this historically oriented genre results in interesting hybrid crossings of diary, memoir, history, biography, autobiography, and novel. While many scholars, and Parfit is just one, have remarked on the interpenetration of fact and fiction in British First World War literature, I think what still remains to be done is to pay concerted attention to the systematic historiographic concerns and the historiographic framing in post-war First World War literature. And I can only offer a brief sketch of this topic here. I'll do so under three headings. Firstly, the novelist as historian. Secondly, discourses of truth and fiction. And thirdly, history as monument. For the purposes of comparison with Thucydides, I'd like to tease out how this group of writers consciously imitate and sometimes parody historical discourse. These writers are mindful of the peremptory claims of history to authoritative accounts of the past, and yet they challenge the scope and legitimacy of historical representation. Many of them adopt the pose of the novelist as historian. A.P. Herbert's novel, The Secret Battle, published in 1919, which is framed as a fictional biography of a fictional character, Harry Penrose, but based on the experience of a naval sub-lieutenant, Edward Dyatt, begins with the sentence, "I am going to write down some of the history of Harry Penrose." The gist of Herbert's novel is a narrative vindication of an officer who served in the Gallipoli campaign in 1915 and subsequently did a tour of duty in the Western Front in France, all the while struggling with nerves and fear, only to be court-martialed and shot for cowardice, for seeking shelter with his men during a doomed offensive. While the title of Herbert's novel is The Secret History, The Secret Battle, Herbert frequently uses the phrase the secret history in the novel as a metaphor for his vindicatory narrative. And in the closing stages of the novel, he sets up an opposition between the official judicial procedures of the court-martial and military history versus the inaccessible secret history that would reveal the truth about Harry Penrose's suffering. The role of novelist as historian is articulated explicitly, rather than implicitly, in Herbert, explicitly in Ford Madox Ford's memoir, It Was the Nightingale, published in the UK in 1933 and the US in 1934. Reflecting on the construction of his famous tetralogy of First World War novels, published collectively as Parade's End, Ford Madox Ford ruminates on the inspiration and motivation behind this tetralogy. The work that at that time, and now, I wanted to see done was something on an immense scale, a little cloudy in immediate attack, but with salient points and the final impression extraordinarily clear. I wanted the novelist, in fact, to appear in his really proud position as historian of his own time. Vera Britton's Forward to Testament of Youth, published in the same year, 1933, as Ford's memoir, presents her own memoir of the First World War as an attempt to write history in terms of personal life and in terms of putting the life of an ordinary individual in its niche in contemporary history. The idea that the important literary work to be done was historical counter-narrative, providing an urgent supplement to what passed for the history of the First World War, resounds throughout all of the corpus of novels that I'm looking at here. The narrator of Richard Aldington's sardonically entitled Death of a Hero, published in 1929, offers a cynical commentary on retrospective histories of the First World War. All this time, the war was drawing steadily nearer. Probably it had become certain since 1911, though most people were taken quite unaware. Why did it happen? Who was responsible? Questions which have been interminably debated already and will furnish exultant historians with controversial material for generations to come. Already one foresees the creation of chairs in the history of the First World War to be set up in whatever civilized countries remain in existence after the next one. Aldington's novel uses many of the same criteria of veridicality and documentary realism as historical accounts, but insists on the autonomy of fiction. This commitment to the autonomy of fiction is reflected in Ernest Hemingway's endorsement for Frederick Manning's 1929 novel, The Middle Parts of Fortune, which was published in 1930 in unexpurgated form as Her Private Suite. And I include Frederick Manning here. He's an Australian author, but he served in a British regiment and wrote about the British experience of the war. In his introduction to an anthology of war writing entitled Men at War, published in 1942, Hemingway wrote that Her Private Suite was, and I quote, "the finest and noblest book of men in war that I've ever read. I read it over once each year to remember how things really were, so that I will never lie to myself nor to anyone else about them." Hemingway's artful discourse on the veridicality of fiction chimes with revived debates about the fictiveness of Thucydides' history that were going on in classical scholarship at the beginning of the 20th century. In the preface to a work entitled Thucydides Mythistoricus, published in 1907, the scholar Francis Cornford had written, and I quote, "It's possible, however, even for a writer of history, to be something much better than trustworthy. It's possible for a writer of history to be an artist," before proceeding to expound a notorious argument about how Thucydides wrote his history under the inspiration of Greek tragedy. The most comprehensive imitation of historical and historiographical discourse that I've been able to find in the critical disillusioned literature in Britain of the First World War occurs in the foreword to Vera Britton's preface to her memoir Testament of Youth. We can subdivide this discourse into a number of themes, and I'll really just read out a sense of the piling up of this historical discourse. In her preface, Vera Britton writes about the exact truth, offering some element of truth, writing as truthfully as I could. She describes the burden of her experience as too real and wants to give a real account, to write about things as they really were. She engages in a lot of historiographical self-fashioning, presenting the work as an attempt to write history, an attempt to put on record a contribution to contemporary history, and says that it's backed up by detached reconstruction and retrospective reflections. Above all, she puts it forward to the reader as a testament. She engages in documentarism, referring to sources on which the account is made, old letters and diaries, documents and records. She also speaks about the value and utility of the work, hoping that she will produce something that might be of value, some elements of usefulness, or something worthwhile. She grounds her account in discourses of memory, invoking memory and hoping to challenge that too easy, too comfortable relapse into forgetfulness. She also searches for historical meaning, hoping that her testament will explain or convey what the First World War meant to people of her generation, that it will be an exposition of the war's public significance, that it will comment on worldwide events. And finally, she has the address to posterity that we have come to expect in the historiographical tradition in the West. She speaks of our successors. She speaks of the depleted generation, which has to make the present and endeavour to mould the future. And she also refers to history's most grievous repetitions. One way of explaining this piling up, and it's, I guess, much more prolific than that we find in the other paratexts that accompanies this disillusioned First World War British literature. One way of explaining it would be to see it in terms of Vera Britton putting forward, very self-consciously, a woman's history of the war and leaning on the authority of historiographical discourse as a way of presenting her work in the preface. But I think that's not fully accurate, because she also intertwines this discourse with a reminder that this is her own very private story, and she takes the reader through the genesis of A Testament of Youth, explaining how in an earlier iteration it started as a novel and how she contemplated just republishing her diaries kept during the war, which were subsequently published posthumously. So she contemplated republishing her diaries, changing the names, but then says that no, she's very consciously settled for this hybrid form of a memoir that blends her historical experience with fiction. Works that are either actual or pseudo-memoirs sustain a constant commentary on their own documentary method, what I've been calling documentarism. They frequently refer to the diaries, letters, transcripts, and interviews on which they base their accounts of the First World War. Siegfried Sassoon's three-part memoir, written in the persona of George Thurston and published in 1928, 1930, and 1936, is a good example of this. In the third and last volume of this series, Thurston's Progress, Sassoon's alter ego George Thurston comments wryly on a sermon given by an army bishop, reassuring the reader that his version is accurate because in a spare notebook I wrote down the main parts of his sermon, so I'm able to transcribe what might otherwise be inaccurately remembered. Insofar as they're offering alternative versions to those contained in government reports, these writers fluctuate between a commitment to the plurivocality of the past and a sense that representation of the war in literature is a zero-sum game. In 1933, Vera Brittain commented on the boom in war literature and described her own intervention in publishing her testament as a late entry into the field. In the preface to his memoir of the First World War, entitled Undertones of War, published in 1928, Edmund Blunden asks his addressee, "Why should I not write it?" where the pronoun it denotes both his account, the volume that the reader is reading, and the war of which it is an account. Another pronoun is important here too in Blunden's declaration, the authorial and narratorial I. Why, when so many other literary figures had turned their hand to writing the war, should Blunden be excluded? Not least among these figures, of course, was the poet Wilfred Owen, whose poems Blunden would edit for a new collection that would appear in 1931. Blunden's first sentence, "Why should I not write it?" rehearses the problematic of war writing, what I've called the historiographical ethics. And we encounter this same problematic at the beginning of Thucydides' history. Thucydides Athenaios sunegrapse ton polemon. Thucydides the Athenian wrote the war of the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. To write the war is simultaneously to record it, and in the process of writing to distort it, to substitute a textual version of the war for the unnarratable totality of the war and the experiences of all who lived through it and who died in it. But as the linguistic turn in historiography has made abundantly clear, there's no war without narration. Even the it in Blunden's Why Should I Not Write It is already pre-written and pre-narrated. As Hayden White remarks, they, historical entities, become historical only to the extent to which they are represented as subjects of a specifically historical kind of writing. Blunden himself got involved in the polemics about which version of the war was most representative, attacking Robert Graves' autobiographical memoir, Goodbye to All That, published in 1929, as a misleading and vicious debunking of honest soldiery and the values that Blunden himself identified with the rank and file of the British Army in the First World War. In his biography of Edmund Blunden, Barry Webb describes an evening, specifically the 7th of November 1929, where Siegfried Sassoon and Edmund Blunden sat down together and annotated Blunden's manuscript copy of Graves's Goodbye to All That with marginal corrections and criticisms. This manuscript is now in the Berg collection of New York Public Library. There was also a private copy that belonged to Siegfried Sassoon with his annotations, which sold privately at auction in 2007. So that's a particularly explicit version of the polemics of the historiographical ethics of the First World War. While unable to see and predict the Second World War, these novels and memoirs are time-sensitive in the sense that they fear the recurrence of war and decry the possibility that future generations might suffer what their generation had suffered. They all seek, in their different ways, to hand on a warning and testimony to the next generation and to an indefinite and obscure posterity. Ford Madox Ford writes that in undertaking Parade's End, he went against his own bias against novels written with a purpose, seeking to write a work, I'm quoting, to write a work that should have for its purpose the obviating of all future wars. The Thucydidean claim that Thucydides set down his account of the war between the Athenians and the Peloponnesians to be an everlasting possession, ktema es ae, is one that resonates strongly with the concerns of these critical First World War writers. In the study A War Imagined, Samuel Hines examined the trope of anti-monuments in pessimistic British First World War literature. What is interesting to me about this anti-monumentalism that Hines describes is that on the one hand, it offers a savage critique of official forms of commemoration, while at the same time holding itself forward as a more appropriate monument to the experience of individual men and women. The preface to Richard Aldington's book, Death of a Hero, published in 1929, declares his work as really a threnody, a memorial in its ineffective way to a generation which hoped much, strove honestly, and suffered deeply. In the first pages of the novel, the narrator reproduces the casualty list citation for his fictional protagonist, George Winterbourne, commenting sardonically that Winterbourne got his neat ration of headstone in France, and then proceeds to contest the value and relevance of the official record of George's death. I quote Aldington as narrator, "I can't claim that I'd set up any altar to the deceased George in my heart, but I truly believe that I'm the only person left alive who ever thinks of him." Before exploding a few pages later, the death of a hero, what mockery, what bloody cant, what sickening putrid cant. There are also fascinating instances in this critical, pessimistic British First World War literature where the alternative monuments of fiction are endorsed as true monuments by public figures. A.P. Herbert's The Secret Battle, which I've already mentioned, published in 1919, was reissued in 1929 with a preface by Winston Churchill, which endorsed the fictional biography of Harry Penrose as, and I quote, "a monument to the agony, not of one, but of millions, standing impassive in marble, to give its message to all wayfarers who pass. It speaks to the uninformed, to the unimaginative, to the headstrong, and to the short-memoried folk who need a word of warning on their path." As Elizabeth Vandiver has shown, there's a paradox about British First World War literature and its relationship with classics. On the one hand, there are copious allusions to Greek and Roman classical literature, which I haven't been talking about here. And these allusions indicate the extent to which classical myths and literature were used to respond to experiences of warfare. But at the same time in this literature, there's a deep distrust and cynicism about the usefulness and relevance of classics for the present day. More than that, there's a suspicion of the malign influence of classics in the present day, in the early decades of the 20th century. As Vera Brittain puts it in her memoir, and I'm not quoting exactly, but paraphrasing, of her experience of being an undergraduate at Oxford before she left to become a voluntary aid division nurse in the Western Front, why spend so much time translating Caesar and other passages of Latin about people killing each other when one's compatriots are killing each other within 150 miles of where you're doing the translation? But this same Vera Brittain also turns in her memoir at several instances to Homeric epic as a source of consolation for the loss of her fiancé in the war and later for the loss of her brother. In many instances elsewhere, officers in the British Army are characterised by their intellectual complacency, where a shallow and imperfect knowledge of Latin is used as a pretext for superior learning. I quote an example from Frederick Manning's Her Privates We, where an officer called Evans is described as an educated pre-war public schoolboy, which means that he remembered half a dozen Latin tags, could mumble a few ungrammatical phrases in French, knew a little history of England, and had a correct accent. This passage, I think, is typical of the deep suspicion of the role that classics might have had in shoring up the idiocies and hypocrisies of the governing classes in Britain, and what were perceived as failures in military intelligence in the field. But as with Vera Britton's ambiguous attitude to classics, ancient Greek authors also in this literature provide a source of creative inspiration and counter-myths to rival contemporary historical fictions. For Aldington, Blunden, Britton, Ford, Herbert and Sassoon, the question of the continuing significance of classics was also a way of confronting the significance and meaning of their own times and their recent historical experience in the light of history. The memoirs and novels that I've been talking about contemplate their own relation to the past, often returning to the distant past of classical antiquity, and insofar as they offer their own account of a past war to future readers, they also insert themselves into this historical relay as well. And this raises the question that if the classics of antiquity and the works that recount them are outmoded and debunked in the present day, what are the stakes or implications for their own versions of a past war projected into the future? I'll end with an example, and it's my only example in this talk, of an explicit Thucydideanism in British First World War literature. This comes from Guy Chapman's novel, A Passionate Prodigality, Fragments of Autobiography, published in 1933. This autobiographical novel ends in disgust with complete contempt for British society and the apparent aims of the war. And it expresses disillusionment in the form of a quotation in Greek, very unusual in British First World War literature to have an untranslated quotation. This quotation comes from Thucydides' Melian dialogue from Book 5 of Thucydides' History, where Athenian envoys are depicted spelling out Athens' aggressive imperial aims to the Melians from the island of Melos, who were trying to resist incorporation into Athens' empire. The line that Chapman quotes is from Thucydides' Book 5, Chapter 91, and I quote from Jeremy Minot's translation. So this is the Athenians speaking. Well, as for this empire of ours, if that came to an end, we would not be too daunted by its passing. The threat to the defeated comes not from other ruling powers like the Spartans, though our dispute here is not with them, but from their subjects, should they be the ones to take on their former masters and get the upper hand. On the last page of his novel, Chapman writes, "Our civilization was being torn in pieces before our eyes. England was said to be a country fit only for profiteers to live in. Esti de upros lacedaimonios hemin or agon. Many of us were growing bitter." Thank you.
I think Emily would welcome discussion or questions.
Chris.
A little question. That was the beginning of the one about of the novel about Harry.
Yes.
Sounds
The
like
Secret Battle.
the secret battle. Sounds actually like a quotation of the beginning of Thucydides. I'm going to write a little bit of the history of one person. I wondered if there was a sense in which the prologues of some of these historical novels engage with that kind of preface, the top way of prefaces.
Could you try to repeat the question?
Yes. So the question here from Professor Krauss, when I called up that slide showing the beginning of H.B. Herbert's The Secret Battle, where the narrator says, "I'm going to write something of the history of Harry Penrose."
Is it the first line?
Yes. That's if you leave aside the preface from Churchill, which was added later. In a way is more comparable to Thucydides. I think that's what you're suggesting, because the preface is embedded in the main work rather than being a paratext in the form of a prologue. And some of these works have several prologues. Yeah, I think that's right. And in my attempt to sort of try and sketch this dialogue between Thucydides and this corpus of literature, I've obviously been stressing points of contact rather than incommensurabilities. By calling this talk How to Write a War, I don't want to imply in any way that Thucydides is normative for a meta-genre of war literature. I think the fascinating thing is the other part of the conversation, how when we turn to this particular corpus, we could also look at contemporary war writing, the ways in which the authors negotiate the strategies of narration of war right back to Thucydides and expose what he chooses not to do, and the lack of prefaces, paratexts that we wrestle with in looking at ancient literature, call to mind the sort of huge sense of gulf and incomparability.
It also, if that is a gesture at Thucydides, suggests that what Herbert is writing is a fragment, is a partial, is a very tiny part of, which fits with the idea of these novels as looking at a person, looking at Vera Brittain herself, just rather than trying to write the greatest war, just a little bit of the history of Paris.
Yes, good. And I think there the tension then becomes between the singularity of the story and its strong authoritative claims to representation or exemplarity, that it can be extrapolated or multiplied out to speak for millions. And, again, the way in which you put that question reminds us of the fact that Thucydides is a person in the war. He writes it in some sense on the authority of having been a general, and yet that person disappears in his account of the war. Thucydides describes himself as two different people in his own account. Victor.
Are there any figures who are comparable to Thucydides in having had significant contact with both sides? For example, I'm thinking of the German names that you see in the lists of the war dead in British universities who returned home to fight against the British. Is there any literature comparable in the specific sense of having been written by somebody who actually has significant contact with both sides?
In this,
in the case of First World War, it's even more complicated.
Can you just say the question again?
So Professor Beers has asked to what extent in this sort of, and this is my admission, the corpus that I've been talking about is a very, very limited collection of post-war novels and memoirs looking back on the First World War, which I've treated as a sort of particular corpus because they are linked by the sort of disillusionment with which they approach the war, and because many of the writers are in conversation with each other and conscious of each other's work. In this corpus that I've been talking about, are there any examples of authors who, like Thucydides, claim to have had exposure to different sides in the war? Not in the ones that I've been talking about. That doesn't mean that they don't exist, not that I know of. The only analogy I can think of is the way in which contact or touch or encounters with enemy combatants make it into the novels as a way of, not shoring up objectivity. Thucydides uses that claim to say in 526, I saw the war from both sides. That's part of the authority and impartiality of my account. We don't get that same stake played out in this body of literature. Other than that, an encounter with the enemy sort of reiterates the sense of the absurdity and idiocy of the conflict, of killing people who in the encounter are revealed to be as human as you.
I suppose that in the movie, in Grande Illusion, where there's the meeting of English aristocracy with the chief of the German, I forget the name of the character, very famous actor, that is where they are in a way, saying we belong to the same class, but now things are really different. And you have, for example, the German officer speaks English. That breaks from the French text, and there's that sort of goodbye to all that, meaning that the notion that there is some type of transnational union of people of a certain class.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what to do with that question, which I take more as an observation. But I think that one of the legacies, if I'm thinking critically now, of thinking about Thucydides as a model of critical war literature is the homogeneity of his focus on the narration of a war, that although he talks about having seen the war from different sides, one can sort of focalize his narrative quite clearly through the Athenian perspective. And as you know, there's a sort of strong tendency to play down those who fought with the Athenians but were not Athenians, the role of slaves from all over the Greek world and beyond in the conflict. And that in contemporary critical historical accounts of the First World War is work that's only latterly being done in thinking about the broader spheres of empire and the ways in which subjects are occluded in these accounts. You get sketches and vignettes of foreigners, as in not British, French, Belgian, German, Austrian, but foreigners from the empire in these novels.
I have a linguistic question. I was struck in the passage, you mentioned Thucydides' use of superlatives, perhaps exaggerated superlatives, making it seem as though this was unprecedented when we know that it really wasn't. But I was struck by a passage in the book 1, chapter 23 excerpt. Never before were so many men made exiles. Never before was there so much slaughter, which includes the fronted, I don't know whether this is Thucydides or Minot, but what strikes me is the fronted negative adverb and the inversion and the scalar, the so many, all of which emphasize this comparison with everything that has ever come before. And what it made me immediately think of was the famous line of a World War I historian in the middle of World War II, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, which involves exactly the same construction. And I wonder whether that any of that was actually in the syntax in the Thucydides passage, or whether that was Minot's intervention in the translation.
Off the top of my head, from what I remember about that passage in Greek, Thucydides 1:23, you do have in the Greek that very stylized negation, which is a trope of Greek rhetoric. And your comparison was with Churchill and his sort of negative tricolon in that famous speech. One could think then not just about fictional accounts of the war, but relays within military rhetoric within the battlefield.
Right. Obviously intended non-ironically, and Churchill's use there in 1940, whatever it was.
Yes.
It's reclaiming it.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to say that Thucydides in that particular instance is using it ironically. I mean, this is part of his strong rhetorical claim that this is the most important war that has ever taken place in the world to this point. But I was suggesting that that then is undermined or begins to crumble when you look elsewhere in his histories at his consciousness of the contingency and relativization of powers in the broader sweep of history. It's very artificial in many ways to do this kind of ahistoricized comparison that I'm doing with Thucydides and this group of British First World War writers. One could equally think about the way in which, say, Shakespeare is used as a companion text for thinking about the experience of war. Frederick Manning's Her Private's We, every chapter is prefaced with an epitaph from Shakespeare. there as well, in this broader project on comparing Thucydides, I'm interested in exhortatory battle rhetoric in Shakespeare's history plays and the ways in which they rehearse tropes, rhetorical exercises from antiquity about the kinds of speeches that you give on the field in battle. We have many examples of those from Thucydides as well. And in the writers who I've been looking at, the British First World War writers, one can look at ways in which they consciously parody those rhetorical models and examples, and yet are themselves invested in the same rhetorical structures.
Last question.
Oh, sorry. I'd like to try to push back against the kind of suitability of these writers and these wars for comparison. I just wonder how you would fit industrialization into your analysis. I mean, Thucydides is making a case for this is the greatest war that's ever happened, and yet wars that follow after it probably resemble it pretty closely for a long time. Whereas the wars that follow the First World War are fundamentally, characteristically different from the wars that precede it, due largely to the large kind of scale industrial technology, revolutions in the means of destruction and killing. And part of Fussel's kind of main point is that this industrialization fundamentally changes the ways in which wars can be talked about and the ways that they can be remembered. And how does this kind of point fit into your analysis, I wonder?
Okay, thank you. So the question is, to what extent does the sort of shift in the military-industrial progression of warfare in the 20th century from the First World War into subsequent conflicts, how does that pose a problem for this sort of historical comparison that I'm doing with the war that Thucydides covers and the writers writing about the First World War? I'm very interested in that question, and I've thought a lot about it in relation to Daniel Pick's book, The War Machine, where he talks about comparative histories of warfare and the art of war, and challenges the idea that the First World War and the Second World War pose a sort of radical paradigm shift in terms of thinking critically about the history of warfare. Obviously I want to respect the difference in terms of military technologies and conceptions of warfare, but yet at the same time, these authors who I'm discussing contain lots of episodes in which characters in the field of battle are engaged in these very same questions. At the start of the war in 1914, where you have King's regulations, dispatches sent out to the field of battle telling you to practice a battle formation or a strategy that is maybe remembered from the Boer War or from a war prior to that, and then catching up as the war proceeds. But some of them, I'm thinking particularly of a character, General Campion, in the second novel in Ford's tetralogy, Parade's End, that novel is No More Parades, has this rant where he writes a letter from the field of battle back to the Secretary of War in London, trying to insist that, in spite of all the differences between all the wars, there are some points of good generalship that remain constant in terms of the need for a sort of singular vision or good channels of communication. So, I agree with your point and your sort of challenge to what I've been saying, other than to say that I don't think it's final or decisive. This is part of a negotiation that is going on in this literature, inserting itself into this relay of writing about war and thinking about where the differences are.
So I'd like to invite you to continue this conversation at a reception in the common room, which is just a few steps down the hall. And I'd also like to thank Emily for a wonderful seminar today.
Thank you.
Thank you.